Hello friends, this video on microorganisms, friend and foe, part 13 is brought to you by examfear.com. No more fear from exam. Now, we spoke about nitrogen fixation. Now, you might be wondering that how is this atmospheric nitrogen coming to the soil? Because we know that atmosphere, the air which we see in the atmosphere, that contains 78% nitrogen. So 78.3 or 78, approximately we can consider it as 78%. So 78% of nitrogen is present in the atmosphere. Now, this percentage remains same all the time. Now, when we say that these microorganisms like the rhizobium bacteria or the cyanobacteria, they fix atmospheric nitrogen into the soil, so does that mean that they take some nitrogen from the atmosphere and fix them into the soil? If that is the case, in that case, this percentage of nitrogen in the atmosphere should decrease, right? Logically, if I say that these microorganisms are taking nitrogen from the atmosphere and they're fixing that nitrogen into the soil, that means the percentage of nitrogen in the atmosphere should decrease. But it says that the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere always remain constant, and we all know that. As a matter of fact, that the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere is always 78%. Have you ever heard that it is sometimes 42% or sometimes 30%? No, it is always 78%. So how is that percentage maintained always? However, we know that there are organisms which are also fixing nitrogen into the soil. So that sounds quite interesting, that there is no decrease in the amount of nitrogen, but at the same time, some nitrogen is getting fixed in the soil. So this entire thing is driven by nitrogen cycle. So nitrogen is constantly being exchanged between different components of the earth like atmosphere and soil through various organisms. And this cycle is taking place continuously. As a result, the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere always remain constant. Like if there are some organisms which are taking of nitrogen from atmosphere and fixing them into the soil, at the same time there are some other organisms which exist which convert the nitrogenous compounds present in the soil and convert and send it back to the atmosphere. So both type of organisms exist. So some of them are taking in nitrogen from atmosphere and fixing to the soil. Some of them are taking nitrogen from the soil and sending it back to the atmosphere. So as a result of these two processes taking place simultaneously, the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere always remain constant. So now we will talk about the nitrogen cycle. We will try to understand the concept of nitrogen cycle. So this picture tells everything on its own. So I really don't need to explain much. But still I'll just try to explain you how exactly the amount or how exactly the nitrogen balance is maintained in the atmosphere. In fact, not only atmosphere, but the balance is maintained between atmosphere and the soil. So let us see how nitrogen gets exchanged between various components of earth. Now, as we all know that the amount of nitrogen which is present in the atmosphere is 78%. Now, there are certain organisms like the nitrogen fixing bacteria which undergo the process of nitrogen fixation. For example, rhizobium is one example, cyanobacteria like Anabaena, nostoc, they are another examples. So all these bacteria, for example, rhizobium or nostoc, Anabaena. So here I have shown in the figure rhizobium which are present in the root nodules of leguminous plants. So these type of bacteria, they convert the atmospheric nitrogen and fix them into the soil in the form of ammonia. So now this ammonia in turn, ammonia is a nitrogen containing compound. So this ammonia in turn can be utilized by other plants for their growth and development, because nitrogen is again a very important constituent, or is a very important nutrient which is needed by the plants. So these plants will utilize the nitrogen which is present in the soil. So that's how plant will get its share of nutrients. Now these plants in turn will be eaten up by another animals, maybe the herbivores. So the herbivores will get their share of nitrogen. These herbivores in turn will be eaten up by the carnivores, so they will get their share of nitrogen. So that's how nitrogen will be passed on from one organism to another. So now all these organisms contain some nitrogen in some or the other form. Now what happens when these plants or animals die? Now when the plants and these animals die, then what happens? Now the dead plants and animal remains also contain a lot of nitrogen. So what happens to this nitrogen? Now what do we do with plants and animals which die? We bury them under the soil. So once they reach the soil, so basically nitrogenous wastes reach the soil. So they are in the form of nitrogenous wastes. That is, they are waste materials which came out of dead and decaying matter, and they are rich in nitrogen. Now these nitrogenous wastes are then acted upon by decomposers. And who are decomposers? Primarily bacteria and fungi. They act as decomposers. That is, they break down the organic dead and decaying matter into simple inorganic form. So these decomposing bacteria, they will convert it into simple inorganic form, that is nitrogen. And these nitrogenous compounds will be present in the soil, and they will again get utilized by these kind of plants. So that's what will happen to some part of the nitrogenous waste. Remaining part of the nitrogenous waste will be taken up by the denitrifying bacteria. Now what do these bacteria do? They will convert the nitrates back into atmospheric nitrogen and return it back to the atmosphere. So if you look at this entire cycle, what do you see? On one hand, nitrogen is being taken out from the atmosphere and fixed into the soil. On the other hand, nitrogen is taken from the soil and given back to the atmosphere. So this is how the amount of nitrogen in the atmosphere always remains constant. And also if you see amongst the various living organisms, the nitrogen continuously gets exchanged, or it continuously passes on from one organism to another. So this describes the nitrogen cycle, and this helps you to understand how exactly the process of nitrogen fixation takes place. So let us quickly have a recap of whatever we have studied in the previous slide, that is nitrogen cycle. So we know that atmosphere has 78% of nitrogen gas. Now this nitrogen is fixed into the soil by the nitrogen fixing bacteria. One example is rhizobium. So what do these bacteria do? They convert atmospheric nitrogen into nitrogen compounds like ammonia, and these compounds remain in the soil. Now when they remain in the soil, plants utilize nitrogen from the soil through these compounds through their roots. Now the plants get their share of nitrogen. Animals eat plants either directly or indirectly. So animals also get nitrogen. Now when these plants and animals die, their dead bodies, they reach the soil. So therefore the dead bodies contain a lot of nitrogen. So nitrogenous wastes reach the soil. Now there are two types of organisms which will act on the nitrogenous waste. One is the decomposers, which will convert some part of this nitrogenous waste into nitrogen compounds, which will be further utilized by the plants from the soil. Whereas other type of bacteria will be denitrifying bacteria, which will convert the nitrogenous wastes into atmospheric nitrogen and send it back to the atmosphere. So roughly this is how the nitrogen cycle takes place. Thank you. Please visit www.examfear.com to watch more educational videos with a better experience. Please do not forget to like and subscribe to our YouTube channel for latest updates. Thank you once again.